All right, welcome everyone to Build Up California's November network meeting. My name is Samantha, and I'm a policy and program officer at the Low Income Investment Fund. And I work on Build Up California, our advocacy initiative related to enhancing and expanding childcare facilities in the state of California. Today, we're going to have a 2024 election recap and hear about how the latest results of the general election impact our work and the field of ECE and facilities in California. We're joined by Courtney Jensen, who has over a decade of legislative association and campaign experience in California and the Southwest. She is Build Up California's and Lyft's personal lobbyist. She helps us a lot with our work in Sacramento and across the state. So before I hand it over to Courtney, this is our quick agenda for the day. We just went over our introductions and housekeeping, and I'll repeat for a third time. If you just joined us, please say hello in the chat, put your name, your organization, and where you are joining us from. The bulk of today's meeting, Courtney will lead, which will go over election recap, and she will also mention Build Up California's policy priorities as they're developing for the coming year. As always, we have a concluding survey, so you can let us know how this session went and how we can improve, and then we will close. So I'm going to hand it over to Courtney.
Thank you, Samantha, and so nice to be with everyone. As Sam said, Courtney Jensen with Fernandez, Jensen, Kimmelshue Government Affairs. We're based in Sacramento, and we are incredibly proud to represent Lyft, the Low Income Investment Fund, and Build Up California in Sacramento. I've been working on, the infrastructure grant program and everything that Lyft and Build Up California have been championing with you all as support. And so a huge thank you for everyone who has been supporting on those issues. And we'll talk about what that looks like in 2025 and the legislative session upcoming. But want to start with the fun of the general election. And some of these numbers are a bit outdated because they're from last week, and we've had a lot of updates in the election numbers since the close of polls last Tuesday. And so just quick updates. So the California Secretary of State will certify the election on December 13th. Elections officials have until December 5th to send sort of final election results to the California Secretary of State. Essentially, what that means is that every race has to be called, all votes have to be counted by that date, and the Secretary of State will certify those elections. It's a little funny because although some seats and elections may not be called until December 13th, the 2025 legislative session actually gavels down and begins on December 2nd with swearing in and an organizational session. We have had in previous elections, people come up to be sworn in that end up not winning their election because of recounts, or people who are not able to come up and be sworn in on that date because their race remains too close to be called. For example, that happened with Senator Hurtado in her last election. And so there are some races that are still too close to call, which I will review. So, even though the Secretary of State will certify the election on December 13th, the 2025 legislative session starts earlier than that. And hopefully all the races will be called, votes counted before that date, but it's always kind of an interesting calendar issue in California. So as a quick just sort of update, we've actually had 14 million ballots counted in California, a little over 14 million counted. The elections officials are reporting that they have a little over 1 million ballots left to count in the state. As a reminder, in California, and I'm sure all of you who voted know this, you can go to the polls, obviously, on election day. You get your vote by mail ballot, and as long as it's postmarked and received 3 days after the election, it's still valid in California to be counted. And so that has led to some delays with the state counting ballots. And it's also obviously a huge state and a huge number of ballots. And so California ends up being one of the longest states to count all of our ballots and get through that, which makes some of these races just take longer to figure out who the winner is. We are at a voter turnout of 63.8%, which is great. Our state has high voter turnout, particularly because of voter registration efforts in California that, a lot of the legislators have championed over the years to ensure everyone is registered to vote, and has made it much easier to vote by mail ballots, and different things. So, a high turnout, 63.8%. For, just general high level on federal elections, obviously we have President Donald J. Trump, who is our president again for the United States. Post Trump winning the election, Governor Newsom and legislative leaders have put out press releases and different things saying, of course, acknowledging that President Trump or President-elect Trump is our president again, and setting California up to again sort of be the resistance to Trump and Republican policies in the country, particularly around climate, immigration, healthcare. And so the governor has called a special session, which in California, essentially that means it's going to be run concurrent with the 2025 legislative session, which goes from January to mid-September in 2025. But along with that, he will do a special session, which allows him to move a budget bill through the legislative process much faster because certain deadlines don't have to be met. So the governor has called a special session to do a legislative vehicle to fund the Department of Justice and different departments and agencies, essentially to defend California laws and to defend California efforts in a legal sense. So in President Trump's last presidency, the state of California sued President Trump over 100 times, or President Trump's administration over 100 times on different policies, whether that's rolling back climate-related efforts, DACA, immigration, Obamacare covered California, things like that. In the special session, he named all of those things in addition to reproductive rights. Obviously, abortion was a huge sticking point in this election between the two parties. And so the governor is sort of setting up the state to ensure that the California policies that the state has championed over the years remain in place. Another one of those that I think is key for all of us is disaster relief. Of course, the state continues to deal with wildfires, flooding, different things, which I'm sure some of you on this call have dealt with personally. And so the governor, as part of that special session, is looking to what the state needs to do to ensure that we are protected and that we have the resources available if the federal government isn't willing to come in and help the state for any reason. California U.S. Senator Adam Schiff. So Adam Schiff won his election to be the one of two U.S. senators for the state of California. He is a Democrat from the Burbank area. He has been a House of Representatives member for years. He beat Republican Steve Garvey. He was elected to a 6-year term to replace current U.S. Senator Butler. Senator Butler decided not to run again for re-election. She was appointed as sort of a placeholder into the U.S. Senate seat after the death of Senator Feinstein. And so he will be, the 6-year term for the California U.S. Senator, along with Senator Alex Padilla. So those would be our two U.S. senators for California. Adam Schiff over the years has been sort of the Trump antagonist, and so it's fully expected that he will sort of continue in that vein as our U.S. senator. So next slide, please. So on ballot initiatives, so some of these numbers have changed a bit, but similar kind of results. So we saw two bonds on the ballot this year. So we have two bonds that are $10 billion each. That is Proposition 2, which is a bond for public school and college facilities. This is K through 12. That has been called and succeeded in gaining the necessary votes to pass. And then Prop 4 is another bond measure, which is going to go to climate-related funding, water, wildfire, those types of initiatives throughout the state. You had Prop 3, which is the constitutional right to marriage. That one passed easily, as you can see. This one was sort of a cleanup, essentially, I would say, when, there was a ballot initiative passed many years ago that said sort of marriage is between a man and a woman. That was deemed unconstitutional, but there was some sort of leftover policies within the California Constitution that reflected that principle. And so this was ensuring that in California, there is a constitutional right to marriage. And then we had a bond measure, or not a bond measure, apologies, Prop 5, which would have been an initiative to lower voting thresholds in California to increase bond ability for local governments to bond for affordable housing and infrastructure. So this would have lowered the requirements for voters to pass those bonds in local jurisdictions from a 2/3 vote to a 55% vote. That has failed. We also had Prop 6, which would have eliminated forcing inmates to work. This was sort of a criminal justice reform bill or initiative that also failed. We had Prop 32, which would have raised the minimum wage to $18 an hour in the state. That also is looking to fail, although it is still close, so it hasn't been quite called yet. We had Prop 33, which would have allowed local governments to have more control over rent control in their jurisdictions. That has failed. That was a continued we've had rent control on the ballot for the last number of years, which is an apartment association fight versus the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And voters, over the last many elections have, declined to approve local government rent control in the state. Democratic leaders, including Governor Newsom and other leaders throughout the state who work on housing policy to increase the availability and development of housing throughout the state, were of course opposed to Prop 33. Because they said that the measure would actually reduce the ability to have more housing built in the state, and were concerned about the initiative's impact on sort of the democratic work that has been done to try to increase more affordable housing development throughout the state. You have Prop 34, which 33 and 34 go around together a little bit. Prop 34 was an apartment association sponsored initiative, which essentially went after organizations like the AIDS Healthcare Foundation to ensure that spending by those types of nonprofits or those types of organizations was going to what the organization was founded to do, instead of funding ballot initiatives with their revenues that they bring in for things like rent control. I think the Apartment Association in themselves is incredibly surprised to see Prop 34 passing, because it is a very complicated initiative, and typically when voters are confused by initiatives, they vote no. But for this one, I think it got a good proposition ballot title, which probably helped it, receive the necessary votes. Prop 35 is a Planned Parenthood sponsored ballot initiative, which is ensuring that the state doesn't sort of take funding from Medi-Cal. It's kind of complicated, but it is it's one that the doctors and Planned Parenthood and others sponsored to ensure that the funding that is available in those accounts in the state is not taken for any other reason. This has been historically a place where former and current governors have gone to sort of boost the budget in California during bad budget times, and then have sort of refunded those accounts when it's in better budget times in the state. We see this a lot with different types of accounts in California with, creative budgeting in bad budget years. But Planned Parenthood and the doctors wanted to ensure that that account was safe from any money being taken from it for purposes that were not, for what the account is set up for. And then Prop 36 is probably the one that you all have heard most about because there was so much talk about it and so much, so many ads and things like that. So Prop 36 is a reform or amending Prop 47, which years ago was a criminal justice initiative to, reduce felonies for theft and drug use and those types of things to misdemeanors, have a little bit more judicial control, those type of things. A lot of folks in California have blamed Prop 47 for what I'm sure you all have experienced with theft and different issues throughout the state, and all the videos you see on social media. And so the district attorneys and many mayors from big cities throughout the state, put forward Prop 36 to reform Prop 47, and to sort of increase those penalties for, multi offenders who have, been sentenced or for multiple thefts and those types of things. And so this one was a huge fight between Governor Newsom and the Democratic Party, and district attorneys and big mayors throughout the state. But it was pretty clear that the voters throughout California sort of want reform in this area. They want some of these theft and drug issues taken care of. It easily passed in every single county throughout the state at, 70% voting. Even in San Francisco, I think it passed by over 60%. So it's pretty clear what the voters are feeling on this topic in California. So on the next slide. So just a couple races and incumbent results I wanted to just flag for everyone. It was interesting, and what I didn't mention on the first slide was sort of this interplay between the presidential election, some very competitive congressional races where a lot of money was spent, and what happened down ticket in some of the Senate and Assembly races. In 2020, when President Biden beat President Trump, California easily, obviously, we are a Democratic state, voted for President Trump or President Biden, and there were a number of counties that voted for him that were historically Republican areas. In this election, because, Vice President Harris was on the top of the ticket, she comes from California, there was a belief by the Democratic Party that, there was some target Republican members that maybe they could flip seats, and maybe they would have the opportunity to increase their supermajority in California. That is not what we're seeing so far in the results. President Trump actually gained votes in the state. He did not lose to Vice President Harris as heavily as he lost to President Biden in 2020. He actually increased his margins in almost every single county in California, and actually took back some counties that had voted for President Biden in 2020. including, areas like Fresno, Enyo, San Bernardino, where Orange County, where he won against Vice President Harris. And so seeing the voting trends in those states or in those areas, particularly with Latino voters, has been very interesting to see the impact sort of down ticket in some of these races that are listed on your screen. So just to quickly kind of go through these. So on incumbent members, which means they are current elected members of the legislature that were running for re-election. Assembly member Josh Hoover, he's from the Sacramento area, was running against a Democrat, and he easily won his re-election. Assemblyman Juan Alanis from the Stanislaus Northern Merced area easily won his re-election against a Democrat. Assemblyman Greg Wallace, who's from the Palm Springs area, although his race is still too close to be called, it looks as though he will win his re-election. That was a kind of a redo of a race in 2022 versus Christy Holstege, where he won by about 80 votes in 2022 against Holstege. And he is winning more than that right now, and is continuing to increase his votes in that district. So it looks as though Greg Wallace will be coming back, and this was an area where Democrats spent heavily to try to flip that seat, and they were not successful. Assemblywoman Lori Davies, her race is very, very close. She's in the San Clemente, Oceanside sort of area, right down the coast in northern San Diego, Orange County down into San Diego. Her race is very, very close against a Democrat. Assemblymember Davies is a Republican, too close to call. She's holding on to her lead, but it is very close. Senator Ochoa Boe, who's from the San Bernardino area, is performing very well. She's a Republican running against a Democrat. Looks as though she will hold on to her seat, but it is very close to call. I will say, again, having said that President Trump flipped San Bernardino and actually won that area, had a huge impact on this race. This was a race that the Democrats, had a potential to flip the seat and weren't able to do it. And so looking at the voting thresholds in that state and the voting trends in that state and how they voted for president and how that impacted this state Senate race has been very interesting to see. Assemblywoman Soria is from the sort of Merced proper area down into Madera and further south than that. She looks as though she will win her re-election. She's running against a Republican. Assemblymember Soria has been doing a great job representing that area and has been, a moderate Democrat, ensuring that she's speaking about the cost of living and, oil, gas prices and those types of issues that have come up that are incredibly important to her constituents. Senator Josh Newman is in Orange County. He is losing his race currently to former Assemblymember Stephen Choi. Again, there was a lot of money spent in this area with an overlapping congressional race. And as I mentioned, President Trump is looking at currently winning Orange County with some votes still pending. But it looks as though that may have had an impact on Senator Newman's race. And then just a couple open seats I wanted to mention. So Assembly District 36, open seats means the current member who is elected to this district is not running for re-election, whether they're termed out or they're running for something different. It is an open race, which means, both parties, there are, two candidates who aren't currently elected are running for those seats. So in Assembly District 36, this is like Imperial and Riverside counties. You have Jeff Gonzalez, who's a Republican, running against Joey Acuna. Right now, Jeff Gonzalez looks as though he will be winning this seat. It's still very close and hasn't been called yet, but voting trends are looking good for Gonzalez. This is currently held by a Democratic member in this seat. So this will be a flip where the Republicans are taking a seat that is currently held by a Democratic member. In 8058, this is Riverside and San Bernardino counties. Sabrina Cervantes, who's the currently assembly member, is running for Senate. Her sister is running for her race. Her sister, Clarissa, is running for this assembly seat. And she is actually losing to her Republican opponent in this seat, which again would be a flip for the Republicans to take a seat that's held by a Democrat. Again, you look at sort of these areas like Riverside, San Bernardino, Central Valley, where, President Trump overperformed what he did in 2020 and the impact sort of down ticket. 8076 in San Diego County. This is currently held by Brian Mainshine, who is a Democrat. It looks as though the Democrats will hold on to this seat with now or incoming Assembly Member Patel beating Christy Bruce Lane. Christy has run in this seat a couple of times, and although it could have been a pickup for the Republicans, it looks as though this one will be held on to. SD 23, this is a seat held by Republican Senator Wilk. This one was called about 2 days ago, and Suzette Valladares will be returning to Sacramento. She was formerly an assembly member and was taken out of her seat essentially by a Democrat, was defeated by a Democratic member, but she will be returning to Sacramento as a senator replacing Senator Wilk. In SD5, this is the Stockton area. So this is currently held by Democratic Senator Susan Eggman. This will be Jerry McNerney. This name may sound familiar to some of you. He was a House of Representatives member for many, many years and was in the assembly previously. He will win this seat, although it was incredibly close between these two candidates. The Democrats will be holding on to this seat. Senate District 7, this is replacing Senator Skinner. Jesse, the mayor of Berkeley, will be winning this seat. This was not a huge surprise. Jesse's supported by current Assembly member Buffy Wicks and many others in that area. Senate District 9, Tim Grayson is going to be replacing Steve Glazer in Senate District 9. Tim Grayson is a current Assembly member. And just a couple other ones, and then I'll move on from this list. Senate District 35. Michelle Chambers versus Laura Richardson. This was one of the most contentious races this year. This is in Los Angeles County. This is still too close to call. It looks like Laura Richardson will pull it off and is going to win, but it is still very close in the votes. And then Assembly District 26, this is to replace Assembly Member Evan Lowe. Patrick Aarons has won this race, although again, very close and very contentious of a race in that area. Next slide. So what does this all mean for the California legislature? This is probably what you guys care about more than all of me walking through some of the names. And so, I think this is one of the biggest questions I get. So, Democrats are losing a couple seats. What does that mean to their supermajority in the legislature? They will continue to have a supermajority in the legislature, which means they have more than enough votes to pass any bill that requires a majority vote. They also have more than enough votes to pass any bill that requires a 2/3 vote. 2/3 votes usually are tax measures, so anything that would increase taxes in the state, or anything that's an urgency measure, which takes place as soon as the governor signs it. So they will continue to have a supermajority. That supermajority looks like it will be a little bit less, but still, incredibly democratically controlled legislature. What I think is the most exciting thing for a woman in this business, a woman in this state, and for women who work on ECE issues and who want to ensure that, childcare providers, women that are taking care of our children and that our children are well taken care of and provided for, is for the first time in California history, The California State Senate will have parity with 20 women senators and 20 male senators. So this is a huge win. The Women's Caucus is becoming one of the, if not the most powerful caucus in the California legislature with the number of women elected officials. It's actually looking like, so that number is about 20, is going to be 21 women elected and 18 men. Janet Nguyen is going to be leaving for to be Orange County supervisor, so she will vacate her seat. But there is going to be, a majority of women, if not exact parity of women in the Senate. The total number of women in the legislature will be at least 55 women, and as many as 60, which is incredible. I mean, we are almost at parity in the California legislature. So next slide. So what does 2025 look like? So I mentioned the special session. So there will be a lot of early budget work with the special session, but also probably other early actions related to things that need to be discussed and dealt with quickly because of actions taken by the Trump administration. But one thing the Low Income Investment Fund and Build Up California will be continuing to work on is the Child Care and Development Infrastructure Grant Program. Of course, all of the money in that program has been allocated to providers and continues to go out for repair and renovation, and then also for major construction and increased number of spaces. We will be continuing to advocate for new funding in that program. If the money is spent and we know that there's, $1 billion need in the state for childcare facilities, we are going to keep pushing, keep advocating to ensure that the success of that program is continued. And then the issue we keep hearing from folks associated with the infrastructure grant program is the fact that the grants are being taxed. And so we are continuing to push to ensure that the grants that childcare providers are receiving through this program are not considered income by the state on your taxes. We have submitted an early action grant or an early action letter to Assemblymember Jackson, who's the chair of the subcommittee that handles budget issues for childcare, and also to Speaker Rivas and to Assembly Budget Chair Jesse Gabriel, asking them to pass early budget trailer language, so before April, early budget trailer language to ensure that we fix this issue and that the grants are not going to be taxed. That's incredibly important. Assemblymember Jackson has been incredibly supportive and is working with us to see if we can fix this in the early part of the year so that those grants are not taxed come April when you have your taxes due. Other childcare facilities support opportunities. So we're continuing to work on other, cutting red tape for co-location of facilities, ensuring that childcare providers know what other funds in the state that you are eligible for, whether that be climate funds or other funds, to ensure that there's easy access to money that you are eligible for. That's infrastructure related. So we are continuing to work on a number of different opportunities, continuing to advocate for facilities, infrastructure as a whole. And then what can you do? So we can't be successful without you and your voices. And we so appreciate everyone who has been with us and with the fight and advocating for more infrastructure grant dollars or telling your story with whether that be CDSS or your local legislators. Our current opportunity, and thank you, we actually have 94 signatories, I think a little over 94 signatories on our early action budget letter. If you are not signed on to that and would be interested in signing on to that, please let Sam or Esmeralda know and they can get you signed on to that letter. And then in 2025, so we there will be so many different opportunities, whether that's coming to Sacramento or hosting a legislator at your facility, or just reaching out to your local elected official to let them know that, more grant dollars in the infrastructure grant program is incredibly important to you, or the grant tax issue is incredibly important to you. So we will be ensuring that we're getting the call to action out to you when all of those opportunities come out. And then I think we have the opportunity for some questions if anybody has questions that we can help answer.
Thank you, Courtney. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or use the hand raise feature, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question of Courtney. I don't see any so far in the chat, so I will kick off with my burning question. Courtney, do you think there are opportunities for childcare facilities to be included in the Prop 2 funds? Or do you think there's any like creative flexibility there?
It's a really good question. So it's something that we had discussed last year as it relates to bonds in the state and whether childcare providers could be eligible for bond funds through Prop 2 or through bonds in the future. I think it is that bond Prop 2 is focused on K-12. So unless it's associated with a local education agency, I think that is where it's probably not going to have a lot of access for childcare providers in the state. Now, I think it is something that, LIF and Build Up California and others continue to talk about with Assemblymember Alvarez and others about how we can get more funding available for facilities in the state, and bonds potentially being one of those. And so I think it is a continued conversation to ensure that legislators are looking at expanding future bonds to not just be K-12 or higher ed, but remember that our ECE needs that support too. So I definitely think it's a good question, Sam, and I think it's something that we will have to continue advocating for as one of the pieces of the puzzle.
Thank you. It looks like Ellen asked a similar question, and she raised the point that TK has a set aside. Do you have any comments on that?
No, not necessarily any comments, although, TK has been one of those, of course, as the schools need support to transition classrooms to serve TK and younger students, because obviously they have to renovate their spaces to ensure that they have smaller toilets and different things to serve those children that they're now being asked to serve. We have the same issues on our end. And it's actually allowed us to have another talking point when it comes to more funding for the infrastructure grant program and other needs, because as childcare providers lose those older students and are now serving more infants and toddlers, we have our own renovations that we have to do to our spaces. And so, it all goes hand in hand. They're getting money over here. We should get money over here. And so it's a good advocacy tool for us to continue to have as piece of our discussion.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat and I will read them aloud. Or you can raise your hand with that feature and I can unmute you. And the same goes for our Spanish language room. Feel free to ask a question in Spanish and it will be interpreted. While we're waiting, I have another question related to Prop 4. I'm curious, kind of a similar question. What are the opportunities for that sort of disaster preparedness and response money being funneled into ECE?
Yeah, you're asking me the tough ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there's a lot to be figured out and decided with Prop 4 and exactly what funds those are going to go into. So, there are potentially opportunities. I mean, I think of the pots of money within Prop 4, safe drinking water. I think that's been a conversation we've had in terms of ECE. Obviously, we have facilities in the state that, have issues with safe drinking water just because that's a community issue. Or if, we've talked about it in the context of lead and things like that. So if there's opportunities within those types of programs for, child care providers to access those funds, I think it's something that the field and we need to explore more. And I think that goes to a little bit of the issues on figuring out some of these pots of money that ECE providers are currently eligible for, but we're not taking advantage of. And we actually worked on a bill with Assemblymember Pappen on that this year because California is a great grant portal where you can go and actually access the state grant portal, and you can type in sort of childcare or small business and find the different pots of money that are currently accessible and that you might be eligible for. The problem that we've had with that program and why we've been working with Assemblymember Pappen is that the grant portal sort of puts everybody in a bucket. We don't have just a child care list of programs in the state that child care providers could be eligible for, because sometimes we're just considered small businesses or fit in different buckets of how they're tagged. And so it's something that we're continuing to work on to ensure that we're figuring out what child care providers can be eligible for. But I definitely think it's something that, as we see the implementation of Prop 4 and Prop 2, with some of the questions I see popping up, that we're going to have to explore more and get more information, out to the field about.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, I'll ask that Prop 2 question. Do you anticipate Prop 2 having any impact on expanded learning opportunities program funds? Um, if you feel like you don't have an answer immediately, because I know it's all very new, we can, Allison, get back to you on a better answer, but I'll hand it to you, Courtney.
Yeah, I think, Allison, we can definitely get back to you with some more specifics about that. I don't have that on the top of my head right now, unless somebody else does. So we'll have to get back to you on the answer on that one.
Thanks, Allison. A good, tough question. Ellen asks, could you repeat the scope of the special session? Are we anticipating having to defend immigrant populations in that session?
So the point of the Prop 2 is for the state, for the legislature, to set aside funds available to the California Department of Justice and the Attorney General and agencies and departments to essentially litigate against Trump administration policies or decisions that would roll back, policies that the state feels is important. And so for example, one of those issues being DACA, one of those issues being Obamacare, one of those issues being access to reproductive services, abortion. One of those, issues being climate, clean truck rules, those types of things. There is not so the scope of the special session is have the legislature allocate money to allow the state to sue the Trump administration, period. Now, there are things like DACA and defending immigrant populations, and ensuring that immigrant populations are protected from, ICE and different things like that the state sued the Trump administration on in the last Trump presidency, that I expect to come back again. But it's not an individually necessarily like point of money that is going to that. It is a just general pot of money to allow the state to be ready for what they need to be ready for.
Thank you. Eileen asks, what will be the most effective advocacy strategies with the new makeup of the state leadership? How should we pivot or adjust? I think
Yeah.
this is related to the Women's Caucus growing.
Yeah, I think, Build Up and LIF and other ECE groups and the ECE Coalition have done an incredible job at mobilizing the Women's Caucus and making sure that childcare is a top priority for that caucus and ensuring that the women elected officials are prepared and ready to speak and ready to fight for our issues. There are even more young women coming into the California legislature in 2025, and even more, young families, young parents. Chris Rogers being one of those that is going to be an assembly member from the Mendocino area and down. And so he is going to be one of those as a young parent who understands the struggle that it takes to have accessible and affordable and safe childcare. And so I think it's incumbent on us first and foremost to educate the new members. What has been done on childcare in the last couple of years, what still needs to be done, what needs to be protected, what is not being done at the federal level, and what the state can do. And we're going to have, 32 plus new members. And so that is a huge, huge crop of new members to educate, but it is also a huge opportunity. So I think first and foremost, it is incumbent on all of us to educate. It's incumbent on all of us to develop relationships with them in their districts, not just in Sacramento. And that looks like site tours, that looks like inviting them to events, that looks like inviting them to, um, you know, uh, uh, ribbon cuttings and doing meetings in their district office. Because I always think that as great as it is to see them in Sacramento, you get so much more of their attention and care when you're talking to them about an issue that impacts a business or families in their district.
Thanks, Courtney. Erica, I see your question. Courtney, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but could you comment on the recently amended Affordable Housing Teachers Act of 2016, which now allows the employees of nonprofit childcare providers to collaborate in building and occupying the education workforce housing? Do you have any insights on how this can benefit the ECE field and what we can do at the state and local level to leverage the amendment?
I don't know, Erica, but we can get back to you on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
Um, any other questions? Maybe I missed some. I see, Chan, you have a question about will providers that do not have subsidized children become eligible for the retirement funds? That seems like a CCPU question. I'd be happy to pass that along, but Courtney, do you know the answer to that?
I do not, but we can find out, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm looking through the chat. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand and I can bring you off mute or put it in the chat. Wait a couple more seconds. Okay. Seems like everyone got their questions answered and we're all still comfortable with the many I don't knows as a result of last week's election. Courtney, thank you so, so much for your presentation. I learned a lot and I hope everyone's feeling noticing those bright spots and feeling activated as we strategize for the coming year. As always, Build Up has a survey that I am about to launch. We'd love to know how this webinar went for you. It's very quick, and we love the results. There's also an open-ended comment section, so you can leave comments. So thank you so, so much. We've ended a little bit early, so I'm going to leave the poll open for 2-ish minutes, and then we'll get a couple minutes back. But thank you all so much. And we will try to get back to all of you that had questions that were a little tougher. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Courtney, again.